Hello everybody, Ben Rogers here, the Raptors Digest with Ryker Richard, breaking down who the Toronto Raptors should face or should want to face as we inch closer and closer to the playoffs. Ryker, the seeds this year have been absolutely wild to follow in both conferences. The top of the East, it's absolutely ridiculous to look at. You'll see the standings down below in the base bar, but we have the standings popping up right here as well. The Heat are currently at number 1, looking like they've kind of run away with the first seed, but the Celtics, the Bucks, and the Philadelphia 76ers are essentially tied, right? They're only a half game apart of each other for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th seeds. Now, the Toronto Raptors, we're neck and neck with the Chicago Bulls right now for the 5-6 matchup. So any of those 3 teams, however these last few games play out, there's probably an equal likelihood we could play any of those squads, Ryker. And I guess the first question we got to dive into is, who do we want to play out of these teams?
The answer, in my opinion, is easy. It's the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, you have a different opinion than me. I think matchup-wise, yes, Joel Embiid is likely the front runner for MVP candidate this season. And yes, there's a ton of offensive star power in James Harden. And yes, they have amassed a more formidable bench now that Tyrese Maxey and their other sort of filler role players have started to step up this season. But I think when you have a team with as good defenders as the Toronto Raptors that have the ability to make a wall around Joel Embiid, that have the ability to chase James Harden around the perimeter and off-ball screens like they did with Fred VanVleet against Steph Curry, that to me seems like the matchup where we can take the most advantage of, because they don't have the same defensive prowess as the Boston Celtics and the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm going with the 76ers, Ben. Who are you picking?
Well, Ryker, if I were to set the criteria in terms of a team that would probably be the best matchup or something like that, the team that will be easiest to beat potentially, even though all 3 of these teams, don't want to discredit any of them, 3 extremely strong teams, superstars left, right, and center on each of these rosters, then you'd probably go Philadelphia. Obviously, I believe we're undefeated against the Milwaukee Bucks this season. We've knocked them out of the playoffs 2 years in the past 5 years. So even though the rosters have certainly shaken up a little bit since the 2017 season when we had DeMar taking down a baby Giannis, and then obviously with Kawhi Leonard, Kyle Lowry taking down the Bucks in the Eastern Conference Finals. But I know they're probably the worst matchup in terms of history with the Toronto Raptors. We were knocked out by them in the playoffs in our last run down there in the bubble. I know they're playing phenomenal as of late, pushing their way from a 12th seed in the Eastern Conference to the 1st seed a couple days ago. I know the Heat have bounced their way back. But you know what? I'm sick of the Celtics winning. I think we got a shot to knock them out first round, and the potential sweetness of a series against the Boston Celtics to get that revenge, in a very tightly contested 7-game series that we had a couple years ago. I'm out for revenge, Ryker. I want all the smoke. I want the Boston Celtics. Probably illogical, probably out of my mind, but I'm confident we can beat any 3 of these teams, and especially without Robert Williams there in the first round, which is another point that I'll sort of dive into, because I think the Celtics could probably beat the other lower seeds in the Eastern Conference. We'd rather face them in the first round rather than the second round. I just want to see the Celtics get knocked out. They're cocky, they're arrogant on their Reddit and stuff. Let's take down those Boston Celtics, get revenge for the 2020 playoffs.
That's a fair enough argument, but you're not really backing it up with why we should play them besides just a little bit of a revenge series.
Ryker. This is why I want to play them.
Which we were only 1 game away from winning that series, right? Yeah. And would we have had an easier time against Miami than Boston in the playoffs, that bubble playoffs? Obviously, yes. Did Miami go to the championship and then also ultimately lose to the Lakers, which I also think the Raptors would have been better suited against? Yes. So there's a whole bunch of hypotheticals that if we ran it back, it would make for an interesting series. And you can't discredit the fact that, like you said, their big rim protector, Robert Williams, who's not actually that big in terms of height, but is number 3 in the NBA for blocks per game this season. I just checked recently, but a lot of things would have to go right in that series because they're a nearly identical composition, except for they have a little bit better or more consistent offensive firepower from Tatum and Brown than we've gotten from Siakam and Van Vliet this season. Now, that said, I think if all of our guys came together and played their best basketball, our top 5, Gary Trent Jr., OG, Scotty Barnes, is better than their top 5, which would include Marcus Smart and Grant Williams. And I don't even know who the 5th player is that's in their starting lineup.
Al Horford is
Al Horford, right? We have a better 5 than they do have, but they have probably the better 2 players than we have better 2 players. So it would make for a fun series.
Yeah, Tatum, you and I joke about Jason Tatum a bunch on this podcast. He would be considered the best player in those series. And honestly, all 3 of these teams would have superstar players that are bigger names, that are higher in the precipice in the NBA right now than our guy in Pascal Siakam. Even though you and I love Pascal and think, we've been fighting for him. You jumped back on the bandwagon. I'm fighting for Spicy P left, right, and center.
I was never far off the bandwagon.
You weren't that far off. You weren't that far off. You had a foot off and foot on, Joshy iced. He was the guy that we throw.
I said, we can tease the market. We can tease and see what kind of value we get back. But now those conversations are shut down, obviously.
That's fair. But I guess the big thing too, and I guess the one logical point you could look at it with facing the Boston Celtics is Robert Williams is a guy that absolutely demolishes the Toronto Raptors whenever they face us. He is going to be out for the first round, will likely be back for the second round, third round, if we do plan on making a deeper playoff push. So you might be better off facing them earlier in the playoffs while they don't have their prime center that is notoriously a Raptor killer. That's something you have to take into account. But I think we both agree they'd probably be the toughest matchup. But I do think you're splitting hairs there. I think you're splitting hairs with the Celtics, the Sixers, and the Milwaukee Bucks because they're all great teams. And the mental advantage...
I disagree. I disagree. I think that there's a big jump in terms of the difficulty level of playing against the Celtics in a series versus playing the Bucks and the 76ers.
Really?
They play very similar type basketball, that the ball is going to be ball dominant in James Harden and Joel Embiid primary's hands, which is ISO basketball. Same thing for the Bucks. It's going to spend majority of the time in Giannis's hands. So we've found, and that's why we've had regular season and postseason success against the Bucks, is because once you find a way to double and triple team effectively their best player, the rest of the guys don't step up in the same way that the Boston Celtics always seem to do, because they seem to have better team offense and better team defense. So I think that there's, neck and neck, 76ers and Bucks. Next tier up in difficulty is Boston.
I see what you're saying. I completely agree, especially from our Raptors lens, because the Celtics role players just always look tremendous against us. But on paper, that Sixers team and that Bucks team are better than the Boston Celtics, in my opinion, right? Especially Milwaukee with Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Brook Lopez now coming back in the lineup, Bobby Portis, who's electrifying for that team. They have a lot of guys on that roster, and obviously James Harden and Joel Embiid. Two stars, Maxey stepping up, Matisse Thybulle, Tobias Harris, who I guess is a negative when he plays against the Toronto Raptors, but they have more talent on those squads, right? So I think the talent factor, just the volume of options that they have, makes them comparable. It scares me equally as much, even though we have that sort of mental advantage, that mental sort of superiority over the Bucks and Sixers over recent years when compared to the Boston Celtics, who have less big names, but obviously have the edge on the Toronto Raptors, Ryker. But we both sort of said our arguments. We both sort of made our takes. Who do you think it's going to end up actually being? Just how it's all going to shake out. What's your predictions before we end this one off?
Prediction, it just seems like we're going towards that Boston Celtics matchup, like you're saying, and we're trying to speak it positively into existence so that we're not taken off guard and go in with negative projections on the outcome. But Ben, whoever it is, it's going to be a tough series all the way to the road to the finals, because the Heat aren't no scrubs. The Chicago Bulls, I think they swept us in the regular season. Brooklyn's way down there in 10th. Okay, so maybe we took one game on them, but that might have been the game where most of their guys were injured. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyways, lots of good competition in the East then. But I'm thinking Celtics. What about yourself?
I think it's going to be the Celtics or the Bucks. I'd be surprised if it's the Sixers. That's what everyone's getting. But it's all guesses. It's all guesses at this point. But I think you and I both agree. Raptors getting the W against whoever they end up facing off. That's That's what we're
got to get out of the
predicting.
first round, Ben.
That's what we're saying. But let us know what you guys think in the comment section below. Who do you want to see the Toronto Raptors face? I want the smoke. I want the Boston Celtics. Riker wants the Philadelphia 76ers and then leave the Celtics for later. Let us know in the comment section below. You're the best to make us far. Check out the Instagram, the TikTok, the Twitter, all that cool stuff. Any last words, Riker?
That's it for me. Well, that's it for me, Ben. Cheers.